You never really forget the moment you realize you don't matter. Not to the people who were supposed to love you, not to the family who should have been there when you needed them the most. For me, it happened in a hospital bed. The room was small, sterile, with that sharp, over-sanitized smell that clung to everything. Machines beeped in slow, steady rhythms. An IV dripped medication into my veins, and I was wrapped in a hospital gown that smelled faintly of bleach. Chemo had taken everything. My hair, my strength, my appetite, my sense of normalcy. But worst of all, it had taken the illusion that I had anyone in my corner. I was alone. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised. My hands trembled as I scrolled through my phone, through the pictures that felt like a punch straight to the gut. Julia's wedding. Her perfect, extravagant, magazine-worthy wedding. The one I wasn't even invited to. The one my parents hadn't even mentioned as I lay in a hospital bed fighting for my life. A photo filled my screen, Julia, in a designer white gown, smiling up at her groom. The venue was breathtaking, decorated with cascading flowers and soft candlelight. A fairy tale scene straight out of a dream. And the caption? A day for family. Wouldn't have been the same without our loved ones by our side. Loved ones. I almost laughed. Almost. My fingers hovered over the screen, scrolling through more photos. My mother smiling as she adjusted Julia's veil. My father laughing with guests. My cousins dancing under twinkling lights. Everyone was there. Everyone but me. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not just from the sickness, not just from the exhaustion that never seemed to fade, but from the brutal truth settling in my bones. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had erased me. Julia wasn't always my sister. She was adopted when we were both young. 6 for me, 4 for her. I remember when my parents brought her home, how they told me I was so lucky to have a little sister. At first, I believed them. I played with her, helped her tie her shoes, shared my toys. I loved her the way a big sister was supposed to. But over the years, something shifted. Julia wasn't just a daughter, she became the daughter. She got the birthday parties with ponies and princess castles, while I got store-bought cupcakes with a candle stuck in them. She got the new clothes, ballet lessons, private tutors, while I got hand-me-downs and silence. She got their attention, their love, their everything. And me? I got used to it. At least, I thought I did. Until cancer came knocking. And I realized just how little space I occupied in their world. I was diagnosed some time ago. I still remember sitting in the doctor's office, fingers curled into my hoodie sleeves as the oncologist explained the next steps. Chemotherapy, radiation, the whole terrifying process. My mother sat beside me, nodding along, offering nothing but a tight-lipped, "We'll figure it out." She never did. After that day, my family barely acknowledged my diagnosis. No hospital visits, no calls, no checking in. They were too busy planning Julia's wedding. Meanwhile, I endured every round of chemo alone. I threw up until my body ached, lay in bed too weak to move, stared at the ceiling in the dark, and wondered if I would die in this place, unnoticed and forgotten. I made friends with the nurses, with other patients, with anyone who would sit with me, talk to me, make me feel human. But not once did my mother walk through that door. Not once did my father call. Not once did Julia check in. I should have been used to it by then. But when I saw those wedding photos, when I saw the people who were supposed to be my family celebrating like I didn't exist, that was the moment I knew. I had been completely erased. The nurse walked in, clipboard in hand, her face kind but professional. "We need someone to sign off on your next treatment," she said. "A parent or a guardian, preferably." I blinked at her, feeling the laughter bubble up before I could stop it. A parent? A guardian? My family? I let out a bitter, breathless chuckle, shaking my head. "I don't have one." The nurse's brow furrowed. "You don't have any family who can sign for you?" "No," I said, my voice hollow. "I don't." She hesitated, as if unsure whether to press further. I could see the sympathy in her eyes, the way she was trying to figure out how a girl like me, young, sick, alone, had no one. But I didn't explain. Because what was there to explain? That my mother had chosen flower arrangements over her dying daughter? That my father had walked Julia down the aisle while I struggled to walk to the bathroom? That they had all laughed, danced, celebrated while I wasted away in this hospital bed? There was nothing left to say. I leaned back against the pillow, closing my eyes. By the time I survived this, if I survived this, I would make a decision. I would never go back. The day I was discharged, I didn't call them. I didn't text, didn't ask for a ride home, didn't check to see if they had finally remembered I existed. I walked out of that hospital alone, and I kept walking, away from them, away from the life that had never truly been mine. I didn't hate them, I just didn't care anymore because they had already made their choice. And now, I was making mine. It's funny how life can change in an instant. One moment, you're sipping coffee in the quiet of your own little world, and the next, a single envelope cracks it wide open. I had spent 5 years building something for myself, a life that was entirely mine. No toxic parents, no perfect sister, no reminders of the girl I used to be. I lived in a small but cozy apartment in the heart of the city, tucked away above my bookstore cafe, the kind of place where the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the pages of well-loved novels. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every morning, I unlocked the doors and welcomed in customers. Regulars who knew my name, new faces looking for a quiet escape, college students curled up in armchairs with their laptops. It was peaceful, it was stable, it was everything my old life wasn't. Until the letter arrived. I almost didn't open it. It came in a thick, ivory-colored envelope, the kind of paper that screamed money and importance. At first, I thought it was a mistake. A business inquiry, maybe? A legal notice for a tenant in the building. But when I saw the sender's name, Hamilton and Green, attorneys at law, something cold settled in my stomach. I knew that name. I had heard it whispered at dinner parties when I was younger, when my father would talk about estate planning and family assets. This wasn't a mistake. It was meant for me. I stared at it for a long time before finally tearing it open. Inside was a letter. A simple, formal statement that managed to rip open every wound I thought had healed. My grandfather was dead. The only person in my family who had ever loved me, the only one who had ever cared, was gone. And in his final act, he had done something no one saw coming. He left everything to me. I read the words over and over again, trying to make sense of them. My grandfather had been wealthy, old money, the kind my parents flaunted but never truly owned. And now, his entire estate belonged to me, not my father and not my mother, not Julia, Mister. The letter listed it out in brutal clarity. The family mansion, an estate worth millions, fully furnished, untouched since the last time I visited as a child. Investment accounts, savings, wealth passed down through generations. Controlling shares in the family business, the very company my father and Julia had spent years treating like their personal empire. It wasn't just an inheritance, it was everything they wanted, everything they expected, everything they thought they deserved. And my grandfather had given it all to the one person they had abandoned. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the counter as the weight of it settled over me. This wasn't just money. This was a message. My grandfather had known. He had known how they treated me, how they left me to die alone while they celebrated Julia's wedding. He had seen through their lies, their cruelty, their empty smiles. And with his final breath, he had chosen to make things right. I didn't know how to feel. I had spent years moving on, trying to forget them, building something that was mine. I didn't want their world. I didn't want their money. I didn't want the mansion that had never truly been my home. I had fought for everything I had, every dollar, every piece of happiness, every moment of peace. And now? Now I was being handed more wealth than I could ever use. More importantly, more power than I ever dreamed of. I could do anything with it. I could burn it all to the ground. Or I could use it. I set the letter down and took a slow breath, letting the truth settle in. For the first time in my life, I held the upper hand. Not my father, not my mother, not Julia, me. And the best part? They had no idea yet. I imagined the moment they would find out. Their shock, their anger, the sheer disbelief when they realized they were left with nothing. The perfect daughter, the golden child, had been overlooked. And the daughter they abandoned? She was now the only one who mattered. I had spent years feeling helpless, powerless, forgotten. Now, I had the chance to make them feel the same way. I wasn't interested in wealth. I was interested in revenge. I picked up the phone and dialed the lawyer's number. When the receptionist answered, I kept my voice calm, steady. "My name is Mia Carter," I said. "I received a letter about my grandfather's estate." A pause, then, "Ah, Miss Carter? Yes, Mr. Green has been expecting your call. Shall I transfer you?" I smiled. Yes, it was time to go home. But this time, I wasn't going back as the girl they left behind. The first call came 2 days after I agreed to claim my inheritance. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew. I let it ring. Then a voicemail popped up. I stared at my phone, my heartbeat steady, controlled. 5 years. 5 years of silence, 5 years of nothing. And now? Now they wanted to talk. I pressed play. Mia, sweetheart, it's mom. A pause, a breath, like she was testing the words, trying them on after years of neglect. I heard about your grandfather's will. We should talk. Call me back, okay? That was it. No, how have you been? No, we miss you? No acknowledgement that she had erased me from her life, that she had chosen Julia's wedding over my literal existence. No mention of the years I spent fighting cancer alone. Just, we should talk. I deleted the voicemail. The next call came an hour later, then another. Each time I let them go to voicemail. Each time the messages grew more urgent. Mia, it's your father. I know you're probably upset, but let's not be rash. Call us back. Sweetheart, please. This isn't something you can handle alone. Let us help. Help! I almost laughed. Where was this help when I was hooked up to IVs, wondering if I'd even see another year? Where was their concern when they were too busy posing for wedding photos while I was vomiting into a bucket? They didn't want me. They wanted what I had. I wasn't planning to look them up. I had no reason to. But late that night, after tossing and turning for hours, I gave in. I opened my laptop and typed in my father's company name. The first thing that came up? Carter Holdings faces financial trouble amid leadership shakeup. I clicked the article. It was worse than I expected. The board was in chaos, investors were pulling out, stocks had plummeted, and the biggest hit? My grandfather's assets, the ones that kept the company afloat, were now legally mine. I smirked. No wonder they were panicking. Julia had spent her entire life assuming she'd inherit everything. My parents had built their future around the idea that Carter Holdings would be their legacy. Now? Now they were desperate, because without me, they had nothing. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. So that was it. That was why they were suddenly so eager to talk. Not because they missed me, not because they regretted what they did, because they needed me. A week passed, and the calls didn't stop. I ignored them. Until I didn't. The latest voicemail was from Julia. Her voice was tight, strained, forced sweetness covering barely contained panic. Mia, it's Julia. Wow, it's been so long, huh? A fake little laugh. Listen, I know things were complicated before, but we're family. We should talk. I pressed delete. Then, on impulse, I dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. Mia, she said, too quickly, too eagerly. You need something, I interrupted. My voice was calm, cold, unrecognizable from the girl they left behind. Silence. Then a nervous chuckle. That's not fair. I just wanted to. Your business is failing, I cut in, my fingers drumming against the counter. The company is tanking. You lost everything when grandfather's assets went to me. That's why you're calling. A sharp inhale. Mia, it's not. I didn't let her finish. I hung up. And that was the moment I made my decision. I was going back, not as their forgotten daughter, not as the girl they abandoned, but as the woman they now needed. The next morning, I called the lawyer. I want a full financial report on Carter Holdings, I said. Everything. I want to know exactly how bad it is. Mr. Green didn't hesitate. Of course, Miss Carter. I'll have the documents sent over by noon. So I ended the call staring out the window of my apartment. The city stretched out before me, busy, chaotic, alive. I had built a life here, a good one. But now it was time to burn the past down. I booked a flight, packed my bags. By the end of the week, I would be standing in front of them again. And this time, they would see me. They would remember. Because I wasn't coming back as their discarded daughter. I was coming back as the one who held all the power. The car ride to the estate was quiet, too quiet. The driver, hired through my lawyer's firm, didn't make small talk. Good. I wasn't in the mood. I stared out the window, watching as the city faded into rolling green hills, the familiar roads winding toward a past I had no intention of keeping. 5 years, 5 years since I had seen the estate, 5 years since I walked out of their lives, discarded and unwanted. And now, I was returning. Not as their daughter, not as their shame, but as the woman who owned everything they thought was theirs. The wrought iron gates creaked open, revealing the grand Carter estate, a place that had never truly been my home. It was still as massive, as imposing, as painfully perfect as I remembered. The manicured lawns, the sprawling driveway lined with imported trees, the massive house standing like a monument to wealth and privilege. And now, it was mine. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking against the stone driveway, my coat wrapped tightly around me as I took in the sight before me. A place I was never meant to return to, a place that had never once fought to keep me. The door swung open before I even reached it, and there they were. My family. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls like a woman in a soap opera. Her eyes widened, taking me in like I was some ghost she had long buried. Mia, she whispered. Oh, sweetheart. My father stood stiff, his jaw tightening, his face carefully blank, calculating, already trying to regain control. And Julia? Julia's forced smile was just a little too slow, just a little too tight. She wasn't expecting me to actually show up. None of them were. They thought I'd take the money and stay away. They thought I'd be too scared to face them. They were wrong. Mia, darling, my mother tried again, stepping forward with a breathless smile. We've missed you so much. I let her hug me. I let her arms wrap around me, let her press a soft kiss to my cheek, like she hadn't ignored my existence for years, like she hadn't chosen Julia's wedding over my life, like she hadn't let me rot in a hospital bed alone. I didn't pull away. I let her pretend. We were so worried about you, she continued, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. You left without a word. We had no idea where you were, what you were doing, if you were okay. I cut her off. Oh, you were worried? I smiled sweetly. That's funny. You didn't seem worried when you were celebrating Julia's wedding. The air shifted. Julia's nails dug into her palm. My father's lips pressed into a thin line. My mother flinched, recovering quickly, shaking her head with a soft, pitiful sigh. Sweetheart, you were sick. We didn't want to burden you with family? I tilted my head. Silence. I let the moment stretch, let them feel it. Then I stepped further into the house, walking through the grand foyer like I belonged there. Because now, I did. I let my fingers trail over the marble staircase railing, my heels echoing against the pristine floors. My mother followed quickly, desperate to smooth over the tension. You look wonderful, Mia, she said, eyes scanning me like she was trying to make sense of who I had become. 5 years ago, I had been frail, tired, fading, a ghost of a girl trying to survive. Now I stood tall, poised, untouchable. They didn't know who they were dealing with anymore. And that terrified them. Julia finally found her voice, her lips curling into something that was supposed to be charming. Mia, I'm so glad you came, she said. We have so much to catch up on. I met her gaze. For the first time in our entire lives, she was the one on edge, the favorite daughter, the golden child, the girl who had always had everything. And now? She had nothing. I smiled. Yes, we do. Her shoulders tensed. Good. I turned toward my father, watching the way his fingers curled into a fist, the way his businessman's mind was working overtime, trying to figure out how to play this. You should have told us you were coming, he said, voice tight. We would have prepared something. Would you? I asked lightly. Or would you have spent the last 24 hours trying to talk me out of taking what's mine? Silence. I stepped forward, lowering my voice just enough to make them listen. I own this house, I said. I own this land, this business, these investments, everything you built your lives around. It belongs to me now. I let the words sink in, let them swallow it whole. My mother inhaled sharply, my father's jaw clenched. Julia's hands trembled at her sides. I had all the power, and they knew it. Mia, sweetheart, my mother tried again, her voice carefully measured. We know the will was a shock, but surely we can work something out. I smiled. Of course. Relief flashed across her face. I'm not unreasonable, I continued. I'd love to hear what you have to offer. My father's eyes narrowed, sensing the trap in my words. Let's discuss this over dinner, Julia cut in quickly, her smile forced, her composure slipping. I let her have that, for now, because I had every intention of making them squirm. And when I was done, they would never erase me again. I had them exactly where I wanted them. For the first time in their lives, they needed me, and I wasn't going to waste a second of it. I played along at first. Let them believe what they wanted to believe, that I had moved past everything, that I was willing to work with them, that I could be their daughter again. I let my mother take my hand at dinner, forced smiles and sweet words dripping with manipulation. Mia, darling, we're so proud of you. You've come so far. Julia would chime in with her practiced charm, her carefully rehearsed lines. Your family, Mia. Of course, we want what's best for you. My father remained quiet most of the time, watching me like I was an unpredictable stock market crash he couldn't quite control. They thought they were playing me. They had no idea I was playing them. I started small. I'd love to make some changes to the house, I said casually over breakfast one morning. My mother lit up, eager to keep me on her side. Of course, anything you want. I made sure the renovations were expensive, unnecessary. A full remodel of my wing of the mansion. Tear down walls, build new ones, install marble floors, replace every antique with modern furniture. Then I had the entire outdoor garden redone. New fountains, new landscaping, a greenhouse just for me. Julia's face twisted as she realized what was happening. What's the point of all this? She muttered under her breath one afternoon, arms crossed as she watched the workers unload a truck of imported tiles. I smiled. I just think it's time for a change. A flicker of something dark crossed her face. Jealousy, frustration, maybe even fear. She knew. She could feel it. The power was shifting, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. Once the mansion was under my control, I turned my attention to the business. Carter Holdings had been my father's pride and joy for decades. Julia had been next in line, the heir apparent. And now, I owned more of it than either of them. I attended my first board meeting without warning, stepping into the glass-walled conference room like I had been meant to be there all along. The executives stiffened. Julia's face went pale. My father, sitting at the head of the table, narrowed his eyes. Ah, Mia, he said, masking his irritation with a forced smile. We weren't expecting you. I took a seat, crossing my legs. That's funny. I own the controlling shares. Seems like I should have been expected a long time ago. A beat of silence. Then I pulled out the reports. Financial discrepancies, shady offshore accounts, bribes disguised as consulting fees. I've been reviewing the books, I said, my tone pleasant, and I have to say the numbers are interesting. Julia shifted uncomfortably. One of the senior executives cleared his throat. Miss Carter, surely you understand how high-level business operations work. I do, I smiled. I also understand how fraud works. My father exhaled sharply through his nose. Mia, let's discuss this privately. Oh no, I said lightly, flipping another page in my folder. I think we should discuss it right here. And just like that, I made my first real move. Over the next few weeks, I made calculated cuts. Employees who had been skimming from the company, fired. Unnecessary expenses Julia had racked up for her personal projects, gone. My father's old-school business strategies that were bleeding money, overruled. Every decision stripped a little more control away from them. Every move made them weaker. My mother watched from the sidelines, pretending to be supportive but seething underneath. Julia tried to keep up her superior act, but I could see the cracks. She was terrified. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't winning, and she didn't know how to handle it. It happened late one evening when I was alone in my study, reviewing more financials. The door swung open. Julia, fuming. I know what you're doing, she spat, slamming the door behind her. I raised an eyebrow, sipping my wine. Do you? She stormed closer, hands clenched into fists. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything? After disappearing for 5 years? I set my glass down, tilting my head. I didn't disappear, Julia. I was left to die. Her jaw tightened. She knew she couldn't argue with that, but she tried anyway. That was years ago, she hissed. And now you have everything, isn't that enough? I stood slowly, walking toward her until we were inches apart. No, I said softly, it's not enough. Her breath hitched. I leaned in, my voice barely above a whisper. Because, for once, you're the one losing. I saw it then. The moment she realized she couldn't stop this. The moment she understood that I wasn't the forgotten girl anymore. I was the one in control, and I was never letting go. It was late when I found it. The house was quiet, the distant tick of the grandfather clock the only sound in the massive estate. I was in my grandfather's old study, sifting through boxes of documents his lawyer had sent over: estate files, old letters, financial records. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just organizing. Then, in a thick manila folder labeled Medical Trust, Mia Carter, I found the bank statements. My breath caught. My grandfather had been paying for my treatments for months, years. Even when I thought I was alone, even when my family had abandoned me, he had been fighting for me. I flipped through the papers, my hands shaking. He had sent money directly to my parents, tens of thousands of dollars, to help with hospital bills, to make sure I got the care I needed, to keep me alive. And then I saw the last transaction. Not a hospital, not a medical center, a luxury event planning company. The date? 2 months before Julia's wedding. My stomach dropped. No, they wouldn't. Would they? I flipped through more documents, faster now, scanning, searching, until I found it. A full financial breakdown of Julia's wedding expenses. A direct payment from my medical trust fund to her venue deposit. Another for her custom designer dress. Another for the catering. I felt something inside me snap. They had stolen from me. They had taken the money meant to save my life and spent it on Julia's fairy tale wedding. And they never looked back. I sat there staring at the papers, rage curling hot in my chest. I had known they didn't love me. I had known they didn't care. But this was evil. I closed the folder, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I waited until breakfast. They were all gathered in the grand dining room, mother, father, Julia, all playing their little roles. My mother buttering her toast, pretending to be the elegant matriarch. My father reading the business section, pretending everything was fine. Julia scrolling on her phone, as if her world wasn't falling apart. I walked in, calm, controlled. The envelope of documents in my hands felt like a loaded gun. I set it down on the table. Go ahead, I said. Open it. My father looked up first, annoyed, suspicious. What's this? He asked. I pulled out a chair and sat down, crossing my legs. Proof, I said simply. Julia barely glanced up. Proof of what? My mother reached for the folder, flipping it open. The second her eyes scanned the contents, her face drained of color. I watched as she realized what I had found. Oh, she whispered. What is it? My father asked, setting down his newspaper. I leaned forward. It's proof that grandfather sent you money for my medical bills. Silence. I tilted my head, smiling coldly. Except you never sent it to the hospital. My father's expression darkened. Mia. No, I cut in, my voice sharp. You used it to pay for Julia's wedding. Julia's head snapped up. My mother let out a shaky breath, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. My father's jaw tightened. I let the weight of my words settle over them. For a long moment, no one spoke. And then my mother broke first. I didn't know, she said quickly, shaking her head, her voice trembling. I laughed. Actually laughed. You didn't know? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. You signed the damn checks. My father sighed, rubbing his temple. Mia, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, I snapped. You stole money meant for my treatment. You let me suffer alone so Julia could have her perfect day. Julia finally spoke, her voice shaky but defensive. I didn't know, she insisted. I had nothing to do with it. I turned to her, cold and unforgiving. You knew. She swallowed. You knew, I repeated, my voice low, sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. I leaned forward, staring directly into her wide, panicked eyes. You all knew, I said softly. And you let me suffer anyway. Julia flinched. I watched them squirm, struggle, drown in their own guilt. It was intoxicating. For years, I had felt helpless. Now, I was the one in control. My mother tried to reach for my hand. Mia, sweetheart, please. I pulled away. You don't get to call me that, I said, my voice ice cold. She blinked, lips trembling. I turned to my father. You built this family on lies and greed. And now, I own everything. He clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with resentment. Good. Julia looked at me, her expression breaking, finally realizing what she had lost. You can't just, she started. I can, I said. And I will. I stood up, collected, powerful. Pack your things, I told them, my voice steady. You have until the end of the month to leave. The house is mine now. My mother gasped. Mia, no. I ignored her. I turned to Julia. And you? She stiffened. You might want to start job hunting, I said sweetly, because as of today, you're fired. She sucked in a breath, shaking her head in disbelief. Mia, you can't. Oh, but I can, I said, enjoying the way her world was crumbling around her. I grabbed the envelope of documents, tucking them under my arm. Enjoy the time you have left in this house, I said, walking toward the door. And just before I left the room, I looked back. For the record, I said, my voice dripping with venom, that wedding? It wasn't even that great. And then I walked away, leaving them broken, just like they left me. There was no coming back from this, not for them, not after today. I smoothed the fabric of my blazer, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors as I walked through the towering glass doors of Carter Holdings. The company that had once belonged to my father, the empire that was meant to be Julia's inheritance, the legacy they had built on lies, betrayal, and stolen money. And now it belonged to me. The tension in the boardroom was thick, the air buzzing with anticipation. Executives sat stiffly in their seats, glancing between each other, whispering behind their hands. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know how bad it was going to be. At the head of the table, my father sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Julia was beside him, fidgeting with her pen, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. My mother wasn't here. She wouldn't have dared. No, this battle was between me and them, and I was about to win. I took my seat at the opposite end of the long conference table, setting down my thick stack of documents. Shall we begin? I said smoothly, my voice steady, unwavering. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. My father narrowed his eyes. What is this about, Mia? He asked. I don't appreciate these last-minute meetings. I smiled. I think you'll appreciate this even less. And then I dropped the bomb. I've spent the past few months reviewing Carter Holdings' financials, I began, pushing a stack of papers toward the center of the table. One of the senior board members, Mr. Lansing, picked up the first page, adjusting his glasses. The moment he saw what was in front of him, his eyebrows shot up. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. I leaned back, calm, composed. As of today, I am finalizing my grandfather's will, I announced. The legal challenges have been settled. The transfer of assets is complete. I folded my hands in front of me, my gaze settling on my father. That means I now own 100% of Carter Holdings. Silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath from Julia. My father's face paled, his hands clenched into fists. That's not possible, he said, his voice low, dangerous. I still hold. You held a minority stake, I corrected, tilting my head. Held, past tense. I turned to the legal team seated at the far end of the table. Would you mind confirming that for us? The lead attorney, a man named Harrison Green, nodded. As of this morning, per the finalized execution of the will, all shares previously held by Mr. Carter have been legally transferred to Ms. Mia Carter. He slid a document across the table. This confirms her sole ownership. My father snatched the paper, his eyes scanning it furiously. Julia leaned over his shoulder, reading along with him. The color drained from her face. My father exhaled sharply. Mia, let's discuss this in private. No. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. I think it's best we do this here, in front of everyone. I turned to the board members, the real audience. As you can see, I continued, my voice cool, measured, Carter Holdings has been mismanaged for years. Profits have been siphoned into personal accounts. Corruption has run rampant under previous leadership. I let my gaze flick toward my father and Julia. That ends today. Julia sat forward, her voice shaky but desperate. Mia, you don't understand. I cut her off. Oh, I understand perfectly. I slid another document across the table. Julia Carter's current salary and executive expenses. The board members skimmed the numbers, ridiculous sums for business trips that were actually luxury vacations. A six-figure clothing budget, a private driver. Some of the executives exchanged looks. Julia's position had been a financial drain, and now it was untenable. I turned to her. Effective immediately, you're fired. Her breath hitched. What? You heard me. I crossed my legs, tilting my head slightly. Your role is redundant, Julia. Consider this your official termination. Her eyes widened in horror. She turned to my father. Dad, do something. His face was a shade too red, his pulse visibly pounding at his temple. This is ridiculous, he growled. You don't just walk in here and fire people? You don't know how this business works? I met his glare without blinking. You're right. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. Which is why I've decided to clean house. I let the next words fall like a hammer. You're out too. My father went rigid. What did you just say? I'm removing you as CEO, I clarified, my tone light. Effective today. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he shot to his feet. You can't do this, he growled, his voice low, furious. I built this company from the ground up. No, I said simply. Grandfather built it, and now it belongs to me. His nostrils flared. Julia looked between us, desperate, unraveling. Mia, she tried again, reaching for my arm. Please. I pulled away. You didn't care when I was dying, I said, my voice sharp as glass. You didn't care when I needed you. I let my gaze sweep over both of them. But now that you have nothing, I smiled coldly. Now you want to beg? My father's jaw clenched. Julia's eyes welled with tears. I felt nothing. I turned back to the board, ignoring the two people I had just destroyed. There will be a formal leadership transition over the next 2 weeks, I announced. I will appoint a new executive team to bring this company back to what it was meant to be. A few members nodded approvingly. They weren't loyal to my father. They were loyal to profit, and I was the better investment now. I gathered my documents, standing slowly. This meeting is adjourned. I walked to the door, pausing just before I stepped out. I glanced back, my voice soft. Oh, and Dad? He looked up, rage simmering behind his eyes. Security will escort you out. And then I walked away, leaving them broken, ruined, powerless, exactly how they had left me.